Brith, Sholom, and Haskalah's presentation of Molly Golubcow, our wonderful author, and my good friend, Dr. Wilma Brucker, is going to introduce her since she's the connection.
I would like to introduce my friend Molly Golubcow, who wrote the book Hotel on St. James Place, growing up in Atlantic City between the Boardwalk and the Holocaust. She is a professional freelance writer as well as a technical writer, and lived in this hotel that her parents, who were Holocaust survivors, owned. And this book is about her experiences actually living in this hotel and about the people who live there. I'd like to introduce Molly Golubcow.
Thank you, Wilma. Can everybody hear me just fine? Thank you, Wilma, for putting this seed into the ground, and it became this event today. And I also want to thank Brith Sholom and Haskalah for hosting this. And also I want to thank Wilma and the people responsible for breakfast. That was a big deal. I want to talk to all of you today about the book. And in order to talk about the book, I have to talk about Atlantic City, of course, and my parents. The book is dedicated to my parents. And then we'll talk a little bit about the book itself as well. So I know, I think I can predict the outcome, but how many people here have been to Atlantic City, lived in Atlantic City, visited Atlantic City at least once? Yes. Okay, so all the reasons that you came to the shore, whether it was for a weekend or the entire summer, all the factors in Atlantic City that attracted you, the beach, the boardwalk, the gypsies telling fortunes, Mr. Peanut running around, Steel Pier with all the performers, cotton candy, Coors Brothers, pizza, $1 Million Pier with rides and arcades. I could go on and on and on describing Atlantic City, but all of that wonderful honky-tonk environment that attracted all of you to come visit, that was my backyard. I had it 24/7. I didn't have a swing set in my backyard. We didn't need it because but whether you were a kid or a teenager, that was your backyard. So as someone who was lucky enough to grow up in that environment at the time when I grew up in Atlantic City, it was a dream come true. And to this day, I still live in the Atlantic City area. I live in Ventnor, actually the first street in Ventnor, right over the Atlantic City border, first street in Ventnor. And that love for the shore and that particular piece of the Jersey Shore it's probably in my DNA. And there's a phrase, once you get that sand in your shoes, you can never shake it off. And that has always reflected through my writing. As Wilma said, I was a technical writer. That was my career. And as it sounds, technical writer, it was not very exciting. And I always did freelance writing on the side. And 9 times out of 10, the subjects were about Atlantic City, something happening in Atlantic City, a writer, a chef. And so I'm very much, to this day, connected to Atlantic City. So it kind of makes sense that if I was going to write a book, it would center around Atlantic City or have something to do with Atlantic City. My parents, Harry and Sonia Golubcow, were both Holocaust survivors. They came from a small shtetl, small town in Poland, called Miori, Poland. And my mother and father were not married to each other before the war. My father was 13 years older than my mother. And when the war broke out, my father was already married. He had 2 children, an 8-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl. And my mother was about 18 years old. She came from a very, very poor family, 6 kids in her family. Her mother died when she was 6 years old, so very opposite lives before the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939. So my mother's story, for those of you who read the book, quite different than my father's. So I'll start with my mother's story. She was about 18 years old. She was working in for the Postal Service. At the time, the Postal Service was controlled by Russia, not Poland, because poor Russia gets invaded all the time. The Nazis were invading on the west. The Russians had invaded on the east and taken over that part of Poland. She was working for the post office, so technically she was working for the Russians. When the Germans invaded on the west, the word was, we better move east. And they were given the word to escort a herd of cows further east into the motherland of Russia, because for some reason, the only problem they could foresee is that the Germans would take their cows. So little did they know the true horrors that the Germans were about to inflict on Poland. So my mother and the group of mostly women who were working at the post office walked east hundreds of miles to take whatever cows would survive into Russia, and she remained there for the entire war and was spared having to see and live firsthand what was happening in Poland. My father, on the other hand, was not as fortunate, and his town was eventually taken over by the Germans. The town was ghettoed. That was their process, first ghettoed, and then it was eventually selected for liquidation. So the day of that his town was selected for liquidation, everybody was lined up in front of mass graves pre-dug. And at the last minute, my father yelled out, "Oh my God," because he realized what was about to happen any second here. As he said that, a German soldier took his rifle and hit my father in the side of the head with the rifle butt, which knocked him out. So he fell. And that's what saved his life, because he was already down and then the bullets started flying. That evening, he came to, literally crawled out of a mass grave, and you don't know at that point who's alive, who's dead. He crawled out and he took his chances. He went to a Polish Christian farmer that he knew. He always thought he was a decent man, and he took his chances, and he asked him to hide him, and he did. He hid him for 18 months. My father lived under the floorboards of a very small farmhouse. We're not talking about a basement or a finished basement. We're talking probably a crawl space. One night, the partisans, the Partizana, came knocking at this farmer's door to demand supplies, food. And the farmer said, basically, give me a break. I'm already hiding a Jew. How much can I help? And the partisan said, well, prove it. And he opened the floorboards, and my father came out. And then my father just decided he would just take his chances. He just could not go back under that floor. Took his chances and lived out the rest of his life in the woods with a group of partisans. After the war, my parents, as did other survivors of the war, you go back to your hometown to see what's left, and more importantly, who was left. And so my father came back to a sober realization that absolutely no one in his family was spared. not even a cousin. So of course, his children, his mother, brother, nieces, nephews, not a single person in his family survived except for my father. My mother had one sister survive. Ironically, because she was in the Russian army. She was present, fought at the Battle of Stalingrad. And interestingly enough, that is how she survived, by being in the Russian army. So my parents came back to their hometown, and I spoke to a group of high school students the other day, and they asked, how did my parents meet after the war? And I sort of explained to them, because they're 14-year-old kids, that after the war, people paired up, and not necessarily how we would pair up today, or how many of you paired up with your spouse. There was no dating, let's go out to a movie, do you want to go out to dinner, you want to go for a pizza or anything. There wasn't any kind of real courting at that time. People wanted to get on with their lives, so they paired up quickly. And my parents did so, they paired up. It's in the book, it's a long story, but my father was married to my mother's cousin. So they knew of each other, but my mother was, was probably 13 or 14 years old when they married, maybe even younger. So she would have nothing to do with a grown man. My father was a grown man, he had a business, their chances of interacting were very slim. Hello, nice to see you at the most. But the war changed all that, and so my parents married. They were then in a displaced persons camp, a DP camp in Germany, where my brother was born. And then the young family came to New York City. My mother had a uncle who was living in New York. His family moved to New York before World War II. And then while in New York, briefly, my father heard about this agrarian utopia called Vineland, New Jersey. Where a man could have his own land, and so that attracted my father, so then the family moved to Vineland, New Jersey, and they had an egg business, selling eggs, which was a very sort of popular place for a lot of Holocaust survivors to go. South Jersey was packed with Holocaust survivors who were on farms in the chicken business. I was born on the farm. That's where I entered the scene. And it was probably early to mid 60s. It became clear that the chicken business was not all it was cracked up to be, pun intended. And my parents, as did a lot of other Holocaust survivor families, started migrating towards the Jersey Shore from Cape May and further north. And the Atlantic City area attracted a lot of Holocaust survivors who got into the real estate and hotel businesses. Now, this is a good time to mention, do you think my parents knew anything about running a chicken farm when they moved to Vineland? No, absolutely not. And do you think they went to hotel management school? Do you think they knew one thing about running a hotel? Again, the answer is no. And that just shows you the kind of stuff that these Holocaust survivors were made of, the kind of grit they had. And in my father's case, to be able to literally crawl out of a mass grave and figure out how to put one foot in front of the other and start a new family, start a new business, learn a new language. And that reminds me of one of my father's favorite expressions. And he would use this to describe the situations that Holocaust survivors found themselves in, whether it was a spouse or a profession they were in, what they had to learn a new language, new culture. And in Yiddish, because we spoke Yiddish in the house, my father would say, I'll translate it, yeah, it was Hitler was a strange matchmaker. Hitler gewann Mund which speaks volumes of how, as I said earlier, how these people in many cases paired up, ended up in countries they would have never been in, and running a chicken farm or having a hotel in honky-tonk Atlantic City with customers like drag queens and pimps and drug dealers. So one reason I wanted to write this book was to record my parents' story of survival. But I not only wanted to record their story of survival, I wanted to record their story of resilience and adaptability and this uncanny way of being kind and tolerant and understanding to the people in our hotel. Because now remember, this is the 1970s. This is before there was awareness about LGBTQ. None of that was around especially in the early 70s. And my parents came from another culture, completely different culture. In fact, my mother would say, I don't know, we didn't have this in Poland. This didn't happen in Poland. My father never said anything because I think he knew that that this did happen in Poland. But in any case, to this day, I don't know how people who lived through the hate and the prejudice that they lived through would be able to be so kind to people who in the 1970s, the people in our hotel were considered, those people, other people, them. But we all got along famously, whether your business was a little on the illegal side or not. Everybody got along famously. So that was a second reason I wanted to write this book, to record their unbelievable ability to be tolerant to other people. And I'll give you an example of how my parents, instead of these two cultures clashing, which you would think they would, how smoothly we all got along. So my mother was telling me, I'm probably about 14 or 15, my mother keeps telling me about this nice lady at the hotel who brings her flowers every week. And as soon as I heard her tell me about this nice lady, I was suspicious immediately, because a nice and lady in our hotel, So, I let it go, and I was sitting in the lobby one day, and this lady comes in with flowers. She calls my mother comes out, they have a little conversation, and then the lady leaves. And I said, Mom, is that the nice lady you keep telling me about? And she said, yes. And I said, well, Ma, that's not a lady. That's a man who dresses up like a lady. Remember, this is early 70s, complete with the false nails. And my mother, she looked like a doe in headlights. Her eyes are this big, and you could hear her brain. You could hear the gears turning. And then she looked at me and she said, well, you know what? I don't care. To me, she's a nice lady. And so that really sums up my parents' attitude. Did they think it was right for a man to dress up like a woman? Did they think it was right for someone to sell drugs or be a pimp? Well, of course not. But my father's philosophy was, I don't care what you do, just be quiet, do it in your room, and pay the rent. And if we could apply that to the world today, if we all just left each other alone, it would be a much, much better world. Just pay the rent. And be quiet. Quiet was important. Kept the police away if you did that, and whatever you're doing quietly. So that's a little bit about my parents and their their ability, as I said, to be so kind and tolerant to the people in the hotel. So the hotel itself, I am very happy to say, the building is still standing. Yeah, it's still there. Yeah. And I'm sure everyone here has suffered through a game of Monopoly at least once in their lives, right? Yeah. Okay. So, and as a side note, if anybody ever played Monopoly with me, God help you if you tried to buy the Orange property, which is New York, St. James, and Tennessee, because I didn't care if I won the game or not, but I had to build a hotel on St. James. In fact, the little tokens, the little red hotels, I had mine labeled the Seacrest Hotel. I was ready, always ready to build a hotel on St. James Place. So the building is still standing, one of the few buildings on that street that was not torn down in the name of progress for the casino industry. So the building is still standing, and I go visit her. Sometimes I'll bike down into Atlantic City, or if I'm in that neighborhood, because of its connection to the Orange properties with the Monopoly. So there's a big development, a lot of development and redevelopment going on there. And the project is called the Orange Loop. So there are new bars, restaurants. So it's getting what I call a shot of economic Botox. Because I truly feel, I have to feel that Atlantic City, she's got some wrinkles and cracks right now, but a couple doses of filler, economic filler, and I'm hoping she'll be beautiful again. I will never give up that hope. So anyway, the hotel is on the middle of the block. It's bookended by the Irish Pub, which is it's not a national landmark yet, but it's an Atlantic City landmark. On one end, close to the Boardwalk, and on the avenue end of it is St. Nicholas Church, which is called the Cathedral of Atlantic City. It's an absolutely gorgeous building. And the Seacrest was in the middle of the block. And if you look at the hotel, there were 2 apartments on the ground level. And then you took a flight of steps up, an open staircase up. And there was a big wraparound porch. And we had a lot of wicker chairs and rocking chairs where people could sit and enjoy the salt air, maybe have a drug deal or two, whatever was on your agenda that day. Then you would come into the lobby, and the first thing you saw when you came into the lobby was a big, shiny lacquered desk. Actually, it's sort of this color wood, shiny lacquered desk. And behind the desk sat my father, and he sat there from Memorial Day to Labor Day, 24 hours a day. I don't think he ever slept. They never saw the man even take a nap. And my friends would come over and say to him, Mr. G, when do you sleep? You're always here. He said, in the wintertime. So, I mean, it was a joke, but it was pretty close to the truth that he didn't sleep the entire summer. Behind the front desk were, proprietors' quarters, a couple of rooms, and a big kitchen, which was probably intended to be for the guests of the hotel. We were kosher, and there was no way my mother was going to have bacon or anything like that, or mixing up her milk inflation. That was not going to happen. So it was really our kitchen, unless you wanted them to have a cup of tea or coffee or something, but no cooking in her kitchen. No, that was not going to happen. You'd go back out into the lobby. There were 3 flights of stairs where each floor had rooms. Some of the rooms were private baths. Some of them were semi-private, meaning you had to use the bathroom that was on the floor. The decor of the building was pretty much as eclectic as our clientele, because the building was built in 1929, And there was furniture and decor, wallpaper, things from the late 20s through the 1970s. So it was quite a contrast in decor. But it was, my mother insisted it was immaculate. You know, the bedspread might have been old, but it was clean, immaculate. I still have memories of the laundry service for sheets and towels that was sent out to be laundered, and they would come back in these big packages, and then wrapped in plastic. And when you cut the plastic open, then you got this whiff of freshness, which now I realize God knows what chemicals I was inhaling, but it gave me the impression that it was very fresh, you know, very crisp and fresh. So if anybody comes to Atlantic City, make sure you go to St. James Place and visit the hotel, because she's still standing. And with all this redevelopment going around, I hope she gets another chance to be something more than what she is now, which I believe is low-income housing. So hopefully she'll get another chance to be great again. So the book itself, if you read the book, it's a collection of short stories. And the first story sort of sets the stage, gives you a lot of background about my parents, their background in Poland, and how they migrated, their complete migration from a small town in Muri to Atlantic City. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of steps and details in between there. And then the other stories are about a person or people who lived in one of the rooms in the hotel or the apartments. And people often ask me, why did you write about those people? And certainly over a course of 10 years, there were a lot more people who came into the hotel. But for one reason or another, that conversation between my parents and the people in the hotel, the conversation or the situation stuck in my head. And some of the stories I was about 8 or 9, and some of them I'm an older teenager. But mostly what made an impression on me as a child and a teenager was the juxtaposition of my parents, you know, Holocaust survivors, you know, deeply rooted in Yiddishkeit, juxtaposed with the characters that lived in our hotel. So somehow something clicked in my head, and it always stayed in my head, and eventually it ended up as one of the stories. The book is a memoir, which implies it is nonfiction. And full disclosure, it's about 99.9% nonfiction, but some of the people I talk about in the book are still around. And you know the phrase, change the names to protect the innocent? Well, at the Seacrest, I had to change some names to protect some of the guilty. So other than that, it is 100% accurate. And when the book was out to be published, a little bit before it was about to be published, my publisher called me because he wanted a sort of a, I don't want to say snazzy, but a good subtitle to the book. I mean, the book would be called The Hotel on St. James Place for obvious reasons. And so I was walking on the boardwalk and my phone rang and I picked it up and he said, I think I have a good idea for a subtitle. The Hotel on St. James Place, growing up between the boardwalk and the Holocaust. And I think I literally went like this with the telephone, because I thought, who puts boardwalk and the Holocaust in the same sentence? And I mean, who would put that in the same paragraph? But then when I got over the shock of the nails on the chalkboard kind of noise, I realized that, as bizarre as that sounds, that's exactly how I grew up, between my parents, Holocaust survivors, and everything they went through, and how they dealt with people, and how the lessons they taught me, as I said earlier, juxtaposed with a drag queen, transvestites, and people that are completely the opposite of what the culture that they came from. So that's how the subtitle came to be. When I've been doing these book talks for about 3 years, the book has been out for about 3 years now, and my favorite part of these book talks is hearing from you, to hear your comments, your questions, whether you read the book or not. It also stops me from talking because if you haven't figured it out, I could probably talk about my parents and Atlantic City for days. So I promise I will stop. I'm going to tell you one more story, and then I hope to hear from you any questions or comments that you have. So I'll give you one more story. So it was Yom Kippur, and we, at the time, my family belonged to a synagogue, Road of Sholom, which was a Orthodox synagogue. It was in the heart of Atlantic City at the time. Today, Caesar's Casino is on that property, quite a different building. And, it's after Nila. We're all tired, we're hungry, everybody wants to go home. And the synagogue had big, heavy brown doors. And so the doors open and my family comes out onto Pacific Avenue, one of the main drags in Atlantic City. And who happens to be walking by as we walk out? Fisher, the pimp. Okay, so, and Fisher was a tall black man, and he was he was dressed like, this is the 70s, so he was dressed like Superfly, with the hat and the fake fur and the platform shoes. So, and my father was a short man, so my father comes out, Fisher bumps into him, and my father says, Fisher, puts his arms out, Fisher, and Fisher says, Harry, how you doing? And they give each other a big bear hug. And there was a lot of traffic going on, and I saw there was an Atlantic City police officer directing traffic. And you could see he's staring at this embrace because, in the cartoons when the mouth hits the floor and the eyes bug out. Well, he's staring at this and he's thinking, how could these two possibly know each other? How could these two have ever run into each other? And the answer is Hitler was a strange matchmaker. So now it's your turn. Oh, is that water or something strong? Water. Water. Yes.
What happened to your hotel? I mean, your parents yesterday, you sold it, they sold it.
My parents actually sold the hotel. It was probably 1978, right when the casinos were coming to be. But my parents, it was probably early, maybe 77. Anyway, the people who bought the hotel bought it as an investment. They didn't know how to run a hotel, didn't want to run the hotel, so my parents stayed on and worked for them for 2 years. And then, they were retired. About 40 rooms and two apartments. Yes.
In addition to the colorful characters that you said your parents were very tolerant. What comes through in this book is not just their tolerance. I mean, they actually facilitated or created situations that saved people's lives. And the warmth and the love that comes through is just so amazing. I mean, your parents, especially your father, was able to push away the horror, and the humanity just comes right through. It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
The story of Scooty, especially, and Natalie.
Yeah.
They saved their lives, no question.
Yeah, they did. The first chapter talks about the pimp, the guy who was hugging my father on Yom Kippur. He saved Scooty was her name, and he saved, she was a prostitute, and my father saved her life one day, but not the usual way you would think. It wasn't brute force or anything like that. I won't talk about it in case anybody wants to read it, because it's an interesting way how he saved her life, but it worked. He saved her, and yeah, and another illustration of the two worlds colliding, and it was a happy ending. Yes.
I just want to share, probably was about the late 60s. My wife and I were dating, went to Atlantic City, walking down the Boardwalk. This guy comes up to us and says, all right, I'll speak up. So this guy comes up to us and says, do you like cantaloupe and honeydew? Both, get away from us. And he says to us, well, if you cantaloupe, what will your honeydew?
Yeah.
It's off laughing.
Yeah,
That's my remembrance.
we had two, well, we called them bums back then. They were like homeless guys, but apparently, I forgot his name. I know who you're talking about. And as a kid, we loved it because he would come up to us and say, what will your honey do if you can't elope? And what's honeymoon salad? Let us alone, we're dressing. You know, he had all these silly little sayings that we thought that he was hysterical, you know. And it wasn't him, I think it was Bagman. I can't remember your guy's name, but Bagman, urban legend is that he was like a millionaire and he had all these bags and he had money in all his bags. He had bags of money in his little room that he lived in. I don't know if that's true, but yeah, I remember your guy. Yeah, harmless, but yeah. Yes.
I grew up I went to Israel my year between my sophomore and junior year, and my best friend
They
from
can't
that
hear you.
my best friend from my trip to Israel between my sophomore and junior year lived on this corner of Ventnor and Margate. So like right on that border.
Morgan Garden there.
Yeah, and so we would go down and visit with her all the time, and some of those same characters were still around in the 90s.
Yeah, Atlantic City has always had characters. And I think Atlantic City has been around since the late 1800s as a resort area. And I don't think Atlantic City ever wanted to be like a Cape May, you know, a dry town that was very proper. Since the 1800s, Atlantic City, whether they say it out loud or not, Atlantic City will get you whatever you want. Whatever you're into, whether it's ice cream cones or prostitutes or whatever you need, we'll find it for you, legal or illegal. You know, it is what it is.
And I will say that I lean towards it not being said as tolerance, but said as welcoming.
Yes. Whatever floats your boat, we'll take care of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, are you an only child? You have any siblings?
I have an older brother. He's 10 years older than I am. So when we moved from the farm in Vineland to Atlantic City, I was about 8. So he was 18. So he was pretty much out of the house. He was in college, and he would come home for visits, but he did not live in the hotel like I did. And his childhood is mostly Vineland. So his stories come out of Vineland.
So he was your biological brother?
Yes.
And then your father's other 2 kids perished?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So first, my experience before the casinos, when I thought Atlantic City was just another resort town, beach town, I was very involved with United Synagogue Youth. We used to have our board meetings at the Breakers in Atlantic City. And it was lovely. I didn't get any of that feeling. I guess they protected us well. I I'm curious if this hotel already existed and had this clientele before your parents bought it?
Probably not, because when my parents bought the hotel, which was in 1970 or so, early 70s, Atlantic City was already in its decline from the days of the way it used to be. So probably up until the early 60s, the way we are all dressed now, there's no way we would have gone on the boardwalk, especially at night, dressed the way we are now. Women had gowns on, furs. Every shop on the boardwalk, even a fudge shop, sold these little caps that women put on the bottom of their high heel to keep them from getting stuck in the slats of the boardwalk. So that shows you how well dressed people were. That every shop had sold these little caps. But by the mid 60s into the early 60s, things changed. Economics changed. It was not taking a jet to Florida or to Las Vegas. That wasn't for jet setters. That became more available to people, so they didn't have to go locally on a vacation. And besides economics, the world was changing. You know, there was all sorts of liberation, gay liberation, Black power, women's lib. The world was changing. And so by the time my parents got the hotel, Atlantic City was a little more honky tonk than it was in more glamorous 50s and 60s and prior to the 50s.
I wonder if they knew that's what they were buying into and raising you in such a location.
You know, when I was growing up, for most of us, there was no such thing as helicopter parents. And, you know, not just me, my friends as well, you know, you got up in the morning, your parents gave you breakfast and said, come home for dinner. And they never saw us again, you know, or in Atlantic City, here's 50 cents, go to Steel Pier, see you for dinner. And we all, you know, the kids all hung out with each other. And my parents were too busy to worry about where I was all day. And I was around a lot of trouble, but I guess I knew enough to stay away, just enough to not get sucked into that kind of trouble.
Were most of your friends Jewish, or did you have a lot of Christian friends?
Yeah, it was a mix, yeah.
I mean, personally, I could listen to your stories for hours.
Yes.
I'm also raised by Holocaust survivors and child, and my parents seemed to do everything in their power to protect me from the stories and from the horrors, and it was never talked about. So it wasn't until I was closer to adult years to start to get it. Was it different for you growing up? Because you seem to have a clear grasp on what they went through.
Yes, as a child of Holocaust survivors, as a child, I thought everybody talked about the Holocaust. And my parents' friends would come over, most of their friends were other Holocaust survivors. And no matter what subject they started to talk about, you know, how are the kids, business, the weather, you know, ultimately it would lead back to the war. You know, who died, how old they would have been if they didn't die, how they. So I don't ever remember not hearing about the Holocaust. And so at age appropriate versions, my parents told me about what happened. I mean, I was a child and I knew what the swastika was, the Nazi emblem. So if I was watching television, like Hogan's Heroes or a World War II movie, I knew what that insignia was. And I knew somehow they killed my family members. So, and the older I got, the more details and more age appropriate information. This is not a scientific study by any chance. It's just observance that I had, things I observed from other Holocaust survivor kids that I knew, the more those parents talked about the war, I think the better off their kids were. Because if you had, let's say a mother, I'm making all this up, your mother was in the Holocaust. And of course, during the Holocaust, there was no food, you're starving. And this mother is weird about food, either overfeeding the child or sort of keeping food locked up, some sort of weirdness about food. You're a little kid and you see your mother acting like this and you don't know why, you have no clue why, you just think your mother's weird. And I think it's an injustice, I think, to the child because it's there. You know what, the horrors of that war are in you, whether you're gonna verbally say it or not, it's gonna come out. And I think it's best to just rip the bandage off and get it over with. But it's just my opinion. So I'm grateful that they always talked about the war. I'm named after my father's first wife, Malkin, who was my mother's cousin. So I knew from a child on I was named after his first wife. When you're little, you don't really understand as much, but
Yeah, psychological research supports it.
yeah. Yes.
I want to switch gears just a little bit. My question is, were they still doing pageants when you were there? Because one of the things, so I grew up in Jersey, I went to Atlantic City a lot, but we never had any of the pageants when I was a kid. So I was wondering if they still had the pageants right down the boardwalk.
The pageant parade.
Yeah.
Yes, the pageant parade. Oh goodness, that was, move over the Macy's parade. I mean, in Atlantic City, the Miss America parade, all the stores closed. All the stores on the boardwalk closed. People bought seats. There were either bleacher seats that they would set up that you would buy to sit in. And every year there was a program printed, a color big program of each one of the Miss Americas and a little bio. And then when the parade would go by, people would have their program and it would be Miss Pennsylvania, like Susie Smith, and people would turn to that page and say, Susie, and Susie would do her Miss America. It was a huge deal. Just an aside to that, it was probably in the maybe late 1990s or early 2000s, and New York Avenue was the gay street, and when the Miss Americas would go by the gay street, there some of the gay guys would yell out to the girls, "Show me your shoes," because they wanted to see what shoes they had. So the girls would, which they got yelled at. The pageant said that's not very ladylike to go like that. So some of the girls going forward became a field day with "Show me your shoes," because then each girl tried to have shoes on that were worthy, that would get your picture taken. So for example, Miss Maine would have like lobsters all over her shoes. And so that became a whole big to-do, "Show me your shoes." So, the pageant was created to extend the summer season. So it gave merchants another week to 10 days of business after Labor Day. Yeah, brilliant. Yes.
At one time, I thought Atlantic City was a mecca for Jews. There were kosher hotels. I remember going to an event, my parents' age, at the Breakers.
Mhm.
When was that?
Atlantic City was, I don't think it was forced, sort of, but ethnic groups lived in neighborhood sections. Before the late 60s, the inlet, which is the north end of the island, was predominantly Jewish. So there were many synagogues there, a Jewish community center, lots of kosher hotels, some large like the Breakers, some small, more like rooming houses. So there was a very vibrant Jewish community. And from the mid-60s to the late 60s, Jews started migrating south to the other end of Atlantic City, to Ventnor and Margate. And as the people migrated, so did the businesses, and so did the synagogues and the JCC. So I would say probably by late 60s, early 70s, the majority of the Jewish population went south. Only a couple miles, but went south. I saw another hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about maybe some highlights of growing up in Atlantic City. Tell us what was it like growing up there? Apart from the hotel and everything, just living there.
Yeah, I mean, it was, as I said earlier, it was, I think, a dream come true. I mean, to constantly have that atmosphere in my backyard, you know. We saw movies being filmed there, so I met Jack Nicholson. I was probably 15 years old, and I was sitting and watching him film The King of Marvin Gardens, and he just came over and sat down next to us. I was sitting with my friend, and he sat down. And so, to me, growing up there was always some kind of fun opportunity. Just taking a walk on the boardwalk and everything that was on the boardwalk. The food, the cotton candy, the pizza, the Court Brothers ice cream, Mr. Peanut, the Belgian waffle guy. That, if you ever heard him screaming about his Belgian waffles, oh, they're so good, I mean, this weird thing, similar to the farmer's market that Wilma took me to yesterday. Yeah, at Steel Pier, the kids would go there by ourselves, and there's one of the amusements on the Steel Pier was called the diving bell. So I don't understand how anybody let their child go onto this thing. They basically lowered you down on a cable. I don't even think there was oxygen in there. It's amazing that I guess it was considered a ride, but it was just this big diving bell that they lowered off the Steel Pier into the murky water. And I don't remember how long we were down there. You couldn't see anything, and then they pulled you up. Today, never, ever, ever would. No mother would let their child on there, and there are probably 500 lawyers who would be there with a lawsuit. So it was just a different, fun world. In the book, I talk about, there's a chapter called Lolly and Me, and Lolly, we're still friends. I mean, we were texting this morning, and we talk at least once a day, to this day. And once a year, her mother let her stay at the hotel during the summer, so she got to sleep over. And depending on our age, we packed everything we could into that 24 hours. And when we were teenagers, one of our favorite things to do was go down to the bus station, the Atlantic City bus station, and just sit in the lobby and watch people who probably eventually ended up staying at my hotel, coming and going. I mean, that we thought was fun. So yeah, I wouldn't trade that for the world. It was great. Yes.
I like the ocean. I bet you're a good swimmer.
I like the ocean, and most of my friends don't know how to swim officially, because you don't really, well, there are people who can swim in the ocean, but you just play in the ocean. We were never afraid of the ocean. We could dive in, but doing laps in a pool to this day sounds revolting to me. Sticking my head in the pool, in the water. So, and another phenomenon, I didn't know people went to camps in the summer till I went to college. And people would sit around and say, what camp did you go to? And I went to Rutgers in New
Yes.
Brunswick. In New Brunswick, yeah, and there were about 10 of us from Atlantic City High School, I graduated Atlantic City High School, 10 of us who went to Rutgers. And we all looked at each other, camp, who would go to camp? Like, you know, we would never leave Atlantic City. We would never, like, go sit in a canoe somewhere in the woods. Crazy.
I grew up in Rockaway.
Wilma?
My father had a very different idea about swimming in the ocean. We would go from New York, we would go to Rockaway Beach. We went to Rockaway Beach, and he said, okay, you have to learn how to swim. He didn't say anything. He just let go.
Yeah.
You either learn how to swim or you drown.
Yeah.
So I learned how to swim really early. I knew how to at least splash my head with
Yeah, I mean, I can doggy paddle, I can maneuver, but, you know, Esther Williams kind of swimming.
strong waves. And I learned in college.
Atlantic Ocean.
Yes,
So as a kid, my father was a high school teacher, so we went to Atlantic City every year for the teachers' convention.
oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, I'm sure the teachers' convention was one of the more important conventions that was there, but did they have interesting conventions that you were aware of that you could tell us about?
The Shriners, they're crazy. The Shriners were crazy, they would ride around in, like mini little tricycles. Not, they didn't take a kid's tricycle, they were like mini bikes and tricycles. I'm sure they were all drunk, and they were all on the boardwalk, doing all sorts of shenanigans. And so I remember the Shriners, and I remember the Firemen's Convention. They were so bad, they got banned out of Atlantic City. Yeah. I mean, they would throw mattresses on fire outside their motel. I mean, they were, yeah. To serve and protect, yeah.
The summer sounds like fun. What were the winters like?
Before casino gambling, very quiet, very quiet. A lot of businesses, the shopkeepers made their entire year's salary or in those 3-4 months. A lot of teachers, you know, they taught in the winter and then they had a side business during the summer. So it was sort of more quieter, sleepier. But yeah. Yes.
Molly, you started off talking about what your mom and dad experienced, and I wanted to go back to that second. And that is, as you look back, what are some of the most important lessons that they may have provided to you that you would love to see perpetuated, especially now that we're losing so many actual Holocaust or horror survivors that you think are so important for us to perpetuate, my generation, the generation here, that you think are so important for us to carry forward?
That's a good question. What lessons are there to be learned here? And I think the first lesson is, and we've heard this for decades, is never forget. We cannot forget what happened in Europe from 1939 to 1945, actually even before 1939. And I think when Holocaust survivors were more plentiful, they could tell you firsthand what happened to them. And that's getting to be a scarce commodity. Last year, I was asked to do the Yom HaShoah keynote for our community. And I think I was one of the first maybe to speak who was not a Holocaust survivor, because there are not as many around, and those that were there were 2 there, but they were not well enough to go on stage and do an entire speech. So I think it's on my shoulders now to get that message out, and that's why I wanted to write the book, because that message is now in print or digital forever. And when I wrote the book, I knew that was important because of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denying. Little did I know that it was going to get worse, and little did any of us know that October 7th was coming. So I feel even stronger that that lesson of never forgetting and never stopping to tell people about it and to teach the next generations, whether they're Jewish or not. You know, history applies to all of us, whether we're Jewish or not.
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for that, and thank you for doing the hard work with you to perpetuate our history. My grandfather was a husband who used to spend Pesach. He would be hired to do Pesach services in Atlantic City, so we would be there at the Jewish resort for a week. Did you notice an influx of Jews around Pesach time?
Not really, because, you know, I was in my own home. I was not, we would not go to a Seder at, yeah, no, there were not a lot of Jewish clientele with the Seder.
Because I remember walking the boardwalk and there were other Jews walking the boardwalk and
Yeah.
they were imports for the week like I.
Yeah, I'm sure there were by the time we were at the Seacrest, I think the Breakers was either gone or on its way out. In my day, it was Teplitsky's. That was a kosher hotel and caterer. But that was the other side of the other end of Atlantic City, closer to Ventnor.
Maybe we were the other side. Does anyone here know the Chelsea? We used to go to the Chelsea hotel.
Yeah,
You do?
stayed at the Chelsea. The Deauville, is there something called the Trent?
Traymore Hotel.
Traymore, yeah,
Traymore, yeah.
Traymore, I think they had us like in the evening, my mother took me into the lobby, they had a small, chamber orchestra playing. It was beautiful.
Atlantic City had beautiful
That was
class.
not, the Traymore was not necessarily, somewhere where Jewish residents gravitated to. The Claridge, I think my grandparents played Gin Rummy on the portion of Claridge.
Yeah.
My grandfather was dressed in a tie and a suit to do that.
Of course. Any other question, Tan, comment?
I just am so impressed by, I guess everybody is here, like just so impressed by going through that horror and being so open to survival and not just survival, but thriving and having a heart, and it's just so impressive. I could listen all day if you wanted to keep talking.
Thank you. Yes.
First encounter I ever had 12 Holocaust survivors. I took my children, my two daughters, to Washington DC when they were very young. My husband couldn't go. And we went to the Holocaust Museum. It was the first time I ever went to a Holocaust museum. And they had, they had interviews, interviews of Holocaust survivors and their stories and how they survived, and I don't know if anyone's ever seen that.
Yes.
I was in it was like, it just opened my eyes because my grandparents came to New York before World War I. So they had other bad experiences in Poland, but not that. So to me, that was like unbelievable.
They
It's
want to
unbelievable
reawaken
how
you,
each person explained how they survived and how they're also such successful people. Were able to go on
As I said earlier, it's amazing that they knew how to put one foot in front of the other. When I was a teenager, and I was a typical teenager, and I was having a bad day or some tragedy, like my mother didn't wash my favorite pair of jeans or something, and my father would just shake his head and say, you know what you need? You need a good war. If you lived through a good war, you wouldn't care about your jeans. And of course, I would have to roll my eyes because what does he know, But it's true, he knows, they knew what problems are, when you grow up fortunate not to have to worry about your next meal or who's gonna kill you. Worry about where your favorite pair of jeans is. Yeah.
Now we're in the midst of another good war.
I don't think this one is a good one, but
No.
yeah.
Well, fortunately.
No worse good.
Gonna make a quick announcement. There are yellow wristbands that we have, that anyone who doesn't have can wear for Yom HaShoah. We wear them each year, so save it. It says, never forget on them. They're right outside here. And tonight at 6 p.m., they're gonna start reading names at the Jewish Community Center. And at 7 p.m., there'll be a program at the J for Yom HaShoah and a service. And in the morning, on Monday morning, at the Minyan, 7:45 here, everyone's invited. We are reading Megillat HaShoah, the Shoah scroll. It's a really emotional read of in the voice of a biblical chronicler. We're trying to put a text to Yom HaShoah, and it's being read all over the world. We have these books now